In the early morning hours of December 7, 1941, 8 battleships of the U.S. Navy were in port at Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu in Hawaii. Right before 8 a.m. local time, the Imperial Japanese Navy attacked various locations on the island with more than 350 aircraft from 6 aircraft carriers, targeting the battleships, airfields, and other facilities. As the smoke settled after the two-wave attack, each of the battleships had a variety of damage, ranging from minimally damaged to fatally wounded. This episode will be a quick overview of each of the ship's battle damage during the attack and what happened to each ship after. If you're interested in a more in-depth history on each of these ships, be sure to check out the channel's U.S. Battleships of World War II multi-episode series. But before diving in, let's cover the ships themselves and their locations that morning. There were 8 battleships of 4 different classes. The oldest battleships in service at Pearl Harbor were Nevada and Oklahoma, followed by Pennsylvania and Arizona, Tennessee and California, and then 2 ships from the last U.S. Standard Type battleship class, the Colorado class, which were Maryland and West Virginia. You'll see that 6 of these battleships were in Battleship Row proper, with 4 moored along each other, Arizona next to supply ship Vestal, and Nevada berthed alone to the north. California was berthed alone to the southwest, and Pennsylvania was located in a dry dock to the southwest. We'll start with Nevada, the oldest of the battleships in service at Pearl Harbor that day. She had an advantage of being berthed alone to the north of Battleship Row. She was hit by a torpedo in the port bow a few minutes after Arizona catastrophically exploded at 8:08 a.m. Nevada's crew got her underway 45 minutes after the attack started thanks to 2 boilers being lit the night before. She famously made her way down the channel past the carnage to escape, but would be hit by 5 bombs shortly after, 3 on her forecastle and 2 on her superstructure. Slowly sinking and fires out of control, it was decided to beach Nevada and flood her forward magazines. 50 of her men were killed, with more than 100 wounded. She was slowly fixed, refloated, and repaired enough in dry dock that in late April 1942, she made her way to Puget Sound in Washington for an extensive modernization. Returning to combat in May 1943, she saw service in both the Atlantic and Pacific. Nevada notably covered Utah Beach at Normandy on D-Day in June 1944. She would take part in bombarding Iwo Jima in the Pacific from February to March 1945, and would serve as pre-invasion bombardment for Okinawa later in the month, getting hit by a kamikaze, and returning off Okinawa from June to July. Nevada would receive 7 battle stars during World War II, and she was chosen as the main target ship for the airdrop nuclear bomb test during Operation Crossroads at Bikini Atoll in July 1946. Painted bright orange, the bomb missed and the ship survived, however radiated. Nevada would survive the second blast as well, but was severely damaged. The heavily radiated Nevada would be placed in Pearl Harbor until July 1948, where she was towed offshore and used as target practice, where she was eventually sunk by torpedoes. Down channel from Nevada during the attack, Oklahoma fared much worse than her sister. Oklahoma, berthed next to Maryland, was on the harbor side and more susceptible to attack that morning. Within 15 minutes of the attack starting, 12 Japanese torpedo bombers launched their payload at her, with 5 hits to the port side of Oklahoma. The first 3 hit so quickly that Oklahoma started listing heavily. Within 15 minutes of the last torpedo hit, Oklahoma capsized in the shallow harbor, with heavy loss of life. With a crew of a little more than 1,300 men, 415 were killed. Oklahoma's war was over, and was one of the 2 battleships determined too far damaged to be repaired. Due to her position in the harbor, salvage work didn't start until 1943. Starting in March, a complex salvage operation including 21 derricks would upturn her, with hydraulic winches on shore. After 3 months of slowly uprighting the ship, in June 1943, Oklahoma was worked on, patched up, and refloated in November 1943, and components like 14-inch guns were salvaged. Decommissioned in September 1944, all remaining superstructure and top-end features were removed, and she was put up for auction in late 1946. Sold to a salvage company in California, ex-Oklahoma was towed by 2 tugboats on a trip from Pearl Harbor to San Francisco in May 1947. Around 500 miles east of Pearl Harbor on May 17th, the ships encountered a storm where ex-Oklahoma was swamped and sank rapidly. As Pennsylvania was in dry dock, she was in relative safety compared to the other 7 battleships in the harbor. Still, Japanese bombers went after Pennsylvania, and she was hit by a bomb during the second wave. The bomb exploded in a 5-inch gun casemate on the superstructure, killing 16 men and injuring over 30. Compared to the other battleships during the attack, overall damage to the ship was light. Able to rejoin the fleet almost immediately, she was sent to California for repairs, which started in January 1942. From mid-April to October, Pennsylvania joined other battleships off the U.S. West Coast for defensive maneuvers. She notably took part in multiple campaigns from mid-1943 to late 1944, including the Aleutian Islands, Gilbert Islands, Marshall Islands, Marianas Islands, Palau Islands, and the Philippines Campaign. During the Philippines Campaign, she was part of the famous night action during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in the early hours of October 25th, where 6 older U.S. battleships faced off against the Japanese battleship Yamashiro and her escorts. Known as the Battle of Surigao Strait, this was the last battleship versus battleship fight of the war. As you will see throughout this episode, 5 of the Pearl Harbor battleships would be part of this battle line that night. In January 1945, she headed stateside for a major refit and was off Okinawa by July. In mid-August, she was hit by a single torpedo in the stern from a Japanese bomber, damaging 3 of her 4 propeller shafts, causing extensive flooding. She was saved by her crew. However, 20 men had died and 10 more were injured. Pennsylvania would receive 8 battle stars during World War II. Pennsylvania was also slated for the test at Bikini Atoll in July 1946. During Operation Crossroads, she survived both the airdropped and underwater blasts. Damaged and highly radiated, she was towed to Kwajalein Atoll in the Marshall Islands. Pennsylvania was studied up to July 1948, where she was then towed off the atoll and scuttled. Berthed on the land side of Ford Island and blocked in by the repair ship Vestal, Arizona was relatively safe from Japanese carrier aircraft torpedo attacks that morning. Unfortunately for Arizona, the Japanese also brought level bombers with modified 1,760-pound armor-piercing bombs to attack battleships blocked in by other ships. 2 of these bombs would hit Arizona, the first of which bounced off main turret number 4 into a stern compartment where a fire was started. The second bomb fell between main turrets 1 and 2 on the starboard side, piercing through 3 decks, lighting off propellant magazines, which then quickly started a chain reaction to the forward 14-inch shell magazine, creating an explosion so large that it completely destroyed the front of the ship. Of the 1,512 crew on board that day, 1,177 sailors perished as a result of the fatal explosion that burned for 2 days. Arizona crew members accounted for almost half of the 2,335 military personnel who died during Pearl Harbor. Arizona's 2 aft turrets were used as shore batteries on Oahu, and some other gun barrels were fit on other battleships. She was one of the 2 battleships too damaged to be returned to service for the U.S. Navy during World War II, along with Oklahoma. The Arizona Memorial, opened in 1962, commemorates the sailors lost that day on the ship and serves as a reminder of the Pearl Harbor attack. More than 1.8 million people visit the USS Arizona Memorial every year. Tennessee, inboard from West Virginia, was less susceptible to torpedo attacks that morning like Arizona. Also like Arizona, Tennessee was hit by 2 of the airdropped modified 1,760-pound armored-piercing bombs. The first one hit the middle 14-inch gun of main turret number 2, while the second bomb hit the roof of main turret number 3, luckily breaking apart without detonating. 5 crew were killed, while 21 were wounded. She would receive more superficial damage from Arizona's magazine detonation, as she was moored only 75 feet away to the south. Along with falling debris due to the explosion, burning oil surrounded the ship, and the extreme heat from the fires were buckling Tennessee's hull plates. Trapped by West Virginia, which was sunk by torpedoes, Tennessee wasn't freed from her berth until December 20th. In the beginning of 1942, Tennessee would join the battle fleet, tasked with protecting the West Coast base from San Francisco. In August 1942, Tennessee was relieved from duty and sent to Puget Sound in Washington State for her modernization and an extensive rebuild. With her work finishing in May 1943, she joined a number of the older battleships for shore bombardment duties for multiple campaigns, such as the Aleutian Islands, Gilbert Islands, Marshall Islands, Marianas Islands, and eventually the Philippines. During the early morning hours of October 25, 1944, she was also part of the famous battleship night action during the Battle of Surigao Strait, where she was able to lay down effective salvos against the battleship Yamashiro and her escorts. After a refit, she would be off Iwo Jima from mid-February to March 1945, and then Okinawa later that month. In April, she was hit by a kamikaze, causing 22 deaths and wounding 107 sailors. She stayed on station until May and then retired for repairs. Back in action in early June, Tennessee was off Okinawa, yet again providing support. Tennessee would receive 10 battle stars for her actions during the war. Put into the reserve fleet after the war, she made her way to the Philadelphia Navy Yard, where she was decommissioned in 1947. She was sold in mid-1959 and scrapped later that year. California, moored alone further south of Battleship Row, fared much worse than her sister Tennessee during the attack. California was one of the most vulnerable to torpedo attacks that morning due to her berthing location, and she was hit with 2 torpedoes on her port side during the first wave minutes after the attack started, below the armor belt. Although these hits did not defeat the anti-torpedo system on the ship, she developed a portless and was counterflooded quickly to prevent capsizing. This was made even more difficult as she lost power after the first torpedo hit. Around 45 minutes after the attack started during the second wave, she was hit by a 550-pound bomb dropped by a Japanese dive bomber on her starboard side near a 5-inch gun where it penetrated down below, causing a fire and creating havoc on board. During the attack, 104 men were killed with over 60 wounded, and after the attack, the watertight integrity of the ship was still compromised, where California slowly settled down to the bottom of the harbor by December 10th. Work soon began to raise the stricken battleship, and she was patched up, pumped out, and refloated by March 24, 1942. With more water-tightness prep work taking place in the dry docks at Pearl Harbor, California made her way to Puget Sound on the West Coast by June 1942. California's rebuild work started a few months earlier than Tennessee, with Tennessee's work mirroring California's. As California's damage was much more intense, her rebuild would not be complete until January 1944. She would provide shore bombardment support during the Marianas Islands campaign, starting in June 1944, and then taking part in the Philippines campaign, starting in mid-October, where she was with her sister on the American battle line during Saragasso Strait, taking part in the complete destruction of Japanese battleship Yamashiro. On January 6th, California was hit by a kamikaze on the port side near the main mast off Luzon. The impact, blast, fires, and damage caused 44 deaths and wounded 155 sailors, and would eventually retire for repairs in Puget Sound on the West Coast. After repairs in the U.S., California made her way to Okinawa and would arrive mid-June, right as the battle was about to end. California would receive 7 battle stars for her actions during the war, placed in the reserve fleet in August 1946, and would eventually be sold for scrap in July 1959. Maryland sat along Oklahoma on the land side of Battleship Row during the attack. Maryland would be the least damaged battleships in the water that day, with a 1,760-pound armor-piercing modified bomb strike her forecastle below the waterline, causing minimal damage. A second bomb would strike her near frame 10 and cause minimal flooding. However, the blast killed 4 sailors and injured 14 more. In early 1942, she would join Task Force 1 covering the West Coast and then go to Fiji in November to defend the sea lanes to Australia. Into 1943, she would be based in New Hebrides and would operate in the South Pacific until August. She would take part in the Gilbert Islands campaign in November, Marshall Islands campaign in early February 1944, and Marianas Islands campaign, where she was hit by a Japanese aerial torpedo on June 22nd off Saipan. Hitting her in the bow, damage was limited. However, 2 sailors were killed. Maryland would later be part of the Palau Islands campaign and off Leyte in the Philippines in late October, also part of the American battle line during Saragasso Strait. Maryland was hit in late November by a kamikaze between main turrets 1 and 2, with its bomb penetrating the main deck and exploding. Due to the large fire and explosion, 31 sailors perished and 30 were wounded, and Maryland needed to retire to Pearl Harbor for major repairs. With repairs completed in early 1945, Maryland made her way to Okinawa for a pre-invasion bombardment starting in late March. She would be on station throughout the beginning of the invasion and was hit by another kamikaze on April 7th. This time, the kamikaze hit the top of main turret number 3, which did not penetrate. However, it killed 10 sailors, with 6 missing and 37 wounded. Maryland would retire from the combat zone soon after for a major modernization, coming back into service by the time Japan surrendered. Maryland would receive 7 battle stars during the war, placed in reserve in 1946, decommissioned in April 1947, and sold for scrap in July 1959. The last battleship at Pearl Harbor that fateful day was West Virginia, which was moored outside of Tennessee. She was also in a vulnerable position for aerial drop torpedoes, and she would be heavily damaged during the attack. Within minutes of Japanese planes flying over Battleship Row, she was hit by a probable 7 torpedoes, creating an extremely heavy list of port. To avoid capsizing, the crew was ordered to flood the void spaces and blisters on the starboard side. Along with the torpedo attacks, West Virginia was hit by one of the modified 1,760-pound armor-piercing bombs, which went through the main deck and destroyed the portside casemate secondary armament. With the ship settling into the harbor and on fire, the crew was ordered to abandon ship, with 105 sailors killed and 52 wounded. The complex salvage and repairs took more than a year and a half, and she was able to head to Puget Sound by mid-May 1943. Over the course of summer 1943 to June 1944, West Virginia underwent an extensive rebuild, with her look emulating the Tennessee-class rebuilds. West Virginia provided bombardment supporting the invasion of Leyte in the Philippines in October 1944, and was one of the 6 battleships in the battle line during the Battle of Surigao Strait on the early morning of October 25th. She was deemed the most successful out of the 6 American battleships, with rounds from multiple salvos landing on battleship Yamashiro, helping lead to her demise. In January 1945, she provided shore bombardment for the invasion of Luzon, and then Iwo Jima in mid-February, and then off to Okinawa to start shore bombardment in late March. She was hit by a kamikaze on April 1st, the first day of the invasion, where it hit the superstructure, killing 4 sailors and wounding 7. West Virginia would stay on station until the end of June. She would return back to Okinawa in early August. West Virginia would arrive in Tokyo Bay in late August, and was present during the official surrender of Japan on September 2, 1945. She received 5 battle stars during the war, put into the reserve fleet in 1946, and decommissioned in January 1947. She would be sold for scrap in August 1959. I hope you enjoyed the quick overviews of each of the 8 Pearl Harbor battleships. If you'd like more content like this, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. New videos are coming out soon.